Before we get started with this episode, where I talk with Liz Oyer, the former U.S. pardon attorney, I just wanted to say we're living in a time where the rule of law is being tested, where trust in our institutions is being shaken, where partisanship is threatening to drown out principles. And in this moment, we need people who stand up and tell the truth. We need guardians of fairness, people who don't bend to pressure, political or otherwise. This is a moment that's more than just one person. It's a moment for all of us. It's a time to speak up for fairness, even when it's inconvenient. It's a time to remember that real justice isn't about sides, it's about truth. And Liz Oyer stands as a reminder about the importance of independence and the importance of having an independent judiciary and justice system that is led by people who answer to principle and integrity, not politics. I hope you'll enjoy this episode. I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author, and I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host. Today we have the pleasure of talking with Liz Oyer. Liz is the former U.S. pardon attorney at the Department of Justice and spent more than a decade as a federal public defender championing second chances. She made national headlines after her abrupt termination from the Department of Justice, which followed her refusal to recommend restoring Mel Gibson's gun rights despite his domestic violence conviction, an act she says raises troubling questions about the independence of the Department of Justice. Liz, thank you so much for joining us on Just Justice.
Thanks so much for having me, Jessica.
So, Liz, you first began your career as a federal public defender. I'm also a former public defender, so maybe I'm a little bit biased, but it's always great to have defenders on the show. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you first were drawn into public defense and how that experience shaped your views on your work as you eventually became the U.S. pardon attorney.
Sure. Yeah. Being a public defender really was the foundation for my work as pardon attorney. I had the privilege of representing people who were fighting for their freedom and fighting for their lives in court. And in that role, I had the opportunity to observe really some of the excesses of criminal sentencing in the federal system. And that knowledge was what made me interested in the idea of clemency. As a public defender, I'm sure you know, you often lack the tools to achieve an outcome for a client that feels fair. As a public defender, I was used to having to beg and grovel and plead for outcomes that felt fair. And sometimes that wasn't enough. So I was really in awe of this tremendous power that the president has to grant clemency, to essentially correct an injustice with literally the stroke of a pen. I first became familiar with clemency in 2014 when President Obama launched the Clemency Initiative, which was really the first time that any president had systematically used the clemency power to correct over incarceration, to correct excessive and outdated criminal sentences. And, I became the pardon attorney hoping that we'd see more of that.
Yeah, I mean, what President Obama was able to accomplish was really impressive. Were you involved in that, or were you serving as a federal public defender when that sort of was launched?
I was a federal public defender at that time, and one of my colleagues took it upon herself to review all of the cases of anyone who had been sentenced in the district where I was
Wow.
practicing to see who might be good candidates for clemency. And the office worked to pull together hundreds of applications for clemency, and many of them were successful. And I've been fortunate to get to know a couple of the men who were granted clemency by President Obama. And There are people who are serving life sentences in prison for drug offenses. They're now out in the community doing really incredible things. And the idea that if not for clemency, they could still be in prison, they would die in prison, is really just shocking because they're so much more valuable in the community than they are in prison.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's something that often gets lost when, in the push to create such long sentences for people, we forget that people change and transform, and that what may have felt appropriate at one given moment in time is actually not necessary at another.
That's exactly right. There's very little room for growth and change in federal criminal sentencing because sentences are determinate. You serve essentially your full sentence, but for a little bit of good time credit. And it really doesn't take into account the idea that people can change. And there are so few paths to resentencing and second chances in the federal system. Clemency, which really depends on an action of the busiest man in the country, the president, is the only hope for many people of receiving a second chance. So I would like to see more pathways toward that type of relief that don't rely exclusively on decision making by the president. But for now, clemency is the only hope that many people have of ever leaving prison.
Yeah, and so there you were. You sort of get this dream opportunity to be the pardon attorney of the United States. Could you tell us what the role is of the pardon attorney for folks who may not be familiar?
The role of the pardon attorney is to advise the president about the use of the clemency power. So the pardon attorney receives applications for commutations of sentence and pardons from individuals around the country and reviews those applications, investigates them, and makes recommendations to the president about which ones to grant and which ones to deny. We had a very large caseload when I was in the office, and one of the challenges was to try to make sure that as many of those people as possible got their cases on the president's desk so that he could make a decision.
Just a few months into your position as a U.S. pardon attorney under the Trump administration, someone approached you and asked you to pardon Mel Gibson so that he could get his gun rights restored. And his gun rights had been lost when he was convicted of a domestic violence crime. And what happened?
So, when the new administration came in, the work of the office, my office, really changed. And one of the things that we were asked to work on was restoration of gun rights. That type of relief is a little bit different than a pardon. It's actually something that the attorney general has the authority to do under a federal statute. So she can grant restoration of gun rights to anyone who's lost their right to possess a firearm due to a criminal conviction. And we were asked to become involved in that project of launching this program to restore gun rights really on a broad scale. There are upward of 25 million Americans who've lost their right to own a gun because of criminal convictions. And so we were anticipating being part of a very large initiative of the department to start restoring gun rights to some of those people. I was asked to come up with some potential candidates to receive that type of relief. And was able to go through the pool of pardon applicants and identify some individuals who had been fully investigated and considered for pardons and had undergone an FBI background investigation and the whole works, who were seeking a pardon in part because they wanted to regain their gun rights. Most people indicate that they'd like to be able to go hunting with their grandchildren or something like that. My team and I came up with this list of people who we thought might be suitable candidates for this type of relief, all people who had committed low level nonviolent crimes in the very distant past. And we were then added, I was asked to add Mel Gibson to the list of candidates for this type of relief. I was asked to recommend that the Attorney General grant Mel Gibson his gun rights back. He's not somebody whose case I was familiar with through the pardon process. He's not somebody that I had investigated in the way we had investigated these other folks. And really, all I knew about him was that he had a conviction for domestic violence and that he was a friend of the president and was seeking to leverage that relationship to get his gun rights back.
And so what happened? You said, I'm not comfortable recommending this because I'm really not familiar with this case. And then what happened? What occurred?
Well, I initially stated that I wasn't able to make that recommendation because I believed it was dangerous. The data that exists about domestic violence incidents shows that domestic violence is much more likely to be fatal when the abuser has a firearm. And I was not going to recommend that someone with a domestic violence history regain their right to own a gun, and certainly not without a lot of investigation and a lot more information. So I shared that view. I was asked in a very pointed manner to reconsider that view. I persisted in my view that I could not make that recommendation to the Attorney General. And a couple of hours after I sort of made my final communication that I was not going to be able to make that recommendation, I was fired.
Wow. And how were you fired?
I was in a meeting with about 25 colleagues from different offices within the Department of Justice on a Friday afternoon. And my deputy came into the meeting and told me to grab my bag, and we had to leave right away. And she pulled me out of the meeting. And in the hallway outside the conference room, she told me that there were security officers in my office waiting to escort me out of the building and that I had been fired.
Wow. Now, for folks who don't know this about Liz Oyer, her legal background is sort of impeccable. You went to Harvard Law. You've done just amazing things, and never, I'm sure, in your entire life did you imagine something like that would happen. How did you feel when you saw these security guards waiting to escort you out of the building from your dream job?
It was really shocking. It was just traumatic, I don't think is an overstatement. And it was traumatic, not just for me, but for my entire team. My team saw these security officers, walk into our office suite, which is pretty small, and escort me out of the building without any explanation, no time to say goodbye to my staff. I was told to pack up my things. I literally put my personal effects into a grocery shopping bag and was walked out of the building that afternoon for the last time.
I'm so sorry that it just sounds awful, and not for nothing, but totally unnecessary. I mean, even if they didn't want you to continue in your role as U.S. pardon attorney, one can imagine many better and more effective ways of ensuring the work of the office than sort of summarily firing you and then escorting you right out of the building.
Yeah, it was a really dramatic and upsetting way to do that. I think it really illustrates that the leadership of the Department of Justice is not concerned about the people. They really don't respect the contributions of career employees to the department, and they're not concerned about the well-being of the workforce. The majority of the workforce at the Department of Justice is made up of career employees who have really dedicated their lives to public service, and these people are being cast aside and mistreated. I am certainly not alone in that mistreatment in the Department of Justice in a way that is just unprecedented and really truly upsetting.
Yeah, yeah, and then yeah. And then you were asked eventually, not eventually, but you were asked shortly after your termination to testify before Congress. And what happened before you got a chance to even set foot and provide your testimony?
Yeah, I was scheduled to give this testimony on a Monday, and the Friday before the hearing, I was attending a performance with my parents and my husband that evening. And as I was leaving the performance at about 9:15, I saw that I had a missed call on my phone from a Justice Department phone number and a voicemail that had come in at 9 o'clock that night. And this was a couple weeks after I had been fired. So I was really surprised to see that someone from the Justice Department was calling me at 9 o'clock on a Friday night. So I called back right away, and the person who was calling was essentially a good Samaritan who was calling me out of turn, not supposed to be calling me, to let me know that there were two armed Special Deputy U.S. Marshals on their way to my home to deliver me a letter. and they had been instructed to arrive there between 9 and 10 p.m. And the letter was a warning about my upcoming testimony. This person who called me told me that they knew it wasn't right, and they were very worried that this was going to be really upsetting to my family if these two armed law enforcement officers showed up at our door at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. And I told this person that my teenager was home alone, that my teenage son was the only person home at the house, and I wasn't going to be home before these people arrived at my door. And this person, just out of the goodness of their heart, agreed to try to help me find a way to call this off, and eventually was able to get these officers turned around before they showed up at my doorstep. It would have been absolutely traumatic, I think, for my son to see these officers show up at the door. I think he would have thought something horrible had happened to his parents. So it was a relief that that didn't happen, a huge relief, but it was also very scary in terms of illustrating the lengths that the department was willing to go to intimidate me and prevent me from speaking up about what had happened.
Do you know what was going to be in that letter? Did you ever
Well,
see
I
it?
did eventually receive the letter, which was then sent to me by email, which would have been a much better way to do it from the beginning. Uh, and the letter advised me about all of the professional obligations and legal obligations that I could have been violating through my testimony. I, as a lawyer, didn't think that there was any substance to what was in the letter, but the intent of the letter was to threaten or intimidate me and prevent me from testifying.
Yeah, they wanted to silence you.
Yes. And that made me more determined than ever to go forward with the testimony. I don't like to be bullied, and I certainly didn't want to set the precedent that these types of intimidation tactics could be effective in silencing people. I wanted to set the precedent that people in the Justice Department who were witnessing these types of really misuses of the power of the justice system
Mhm.
should and could speak up about them. So I went forward with my testimony despite what the department did to try to stop me.
Yeah. And what did you say to Congress? What did you tell them?
I really just told them the story. I told them the story of what had happened leading up to my firing and what had happened in the efforts to prevent me from testifying. One of the things that I wanted everyone to know is that this really isn't a partisan issue. This is an issue that should be alarming to people on both sides of the aisle. The Justice Department leadership right now is defying all of the longstanding norms, removing guardrails about ethical conduct, and really placing our country in danger by eliminating career expertise within the department because their sole goal is to promote the president's political agenda.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that that point is so important about eliminating career expertise. Could you just say a little bit more about that for folks who may not be sort of as deeply attuned to what's happening?
Yeah, a huge, really shocking number of career Department of Justice attorneys have been fired or reassigned to menial positions or forced out of the department. And we have lost so much expertise in really critical areas like national security and cybersecurity and civil rights. Hundreds of lawyers and investigators and other staff have been forced out of the department. And many of these folks are being forced out because they don't want to place a political agenda above the laws that they're entrusted with upholding. And as a result of that, we have real deficiencies in the department now in knowledge and experience. And my concern is that it is going to take something really awful happening for us to see the full extent of the damage that has been done by sidelining and removing all of these knowledgeable career experts.
Yeah, because what happens a lot of times is when an issue comes up, if there's no one who actually knows how to respond, then people are sort of left to reinvent the wheel in ways that perhaps are not just or appropriate and certainly don't follow precedent. And then it just creates sort of inconsistencies and chaos, really.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think we're seeing the expertise of the department tested in a lot of different ways now. We're seeing the FBI tested in this investigation that they're currently involved in to catch the killer of Charlie Kirk. We are seeing all manner of chaos within the department that is having real effects in their ability to
Mhm.
respond appropriately to law enforcement emergencies.
And the person who was appointed to replace you was a man named Ed Martin. And Ed Martin was a Stop the Steal activist. And he actually was the lawyer for some of the January 6th insurrectionists. And he's the person who is now the pardon attorney. Uh, What do you know about him and his expertise? And how does that square with what your understanding of the pardons office, the mission of the pardon office is?
Yeah, it's really shocking to see that Ed Martin is the person who has replaced me as the pardon attorney. The pardon attorney has always been a non political appointee. It's always been a career lawyer who is not partisan in that role. And the reason for that is that there's a desire to ensure that pardons aren't completely politicized, that they're not granted only to family members, friends, loyalists of the president. We've seen a lot of examples throughout history. Probably the most well-known pardons are the ones that the public has disapproved of because they did appear to be political in some way. But the majority of pardons are not. They're pardons that are not given out based on politics or loyalties or personal ties. And the job of the pardon attorney is to try to promote that and ensure that that is the way the pardon process operates. Ed Martin is a political operative above all else. He's somebody who has compared January 6th to Mardi Gras in Washington, D.C.
I did not hear him say that. That is interesting for an appointed official to have made that analogy there. Wow.
Yeah, he is a self-avowed MAGA booster, and he has tweeted a couple of times. He's posts prolifically on X, and he has shared his views of the pardon power in connection with pardons. He's said a couple of times, "No MAGA left behind." He appears to believe that the pardon power exists to be able to get MAGA loyalists out of prison, and he has made it clear that
Hmm.
that is his goal. So he has supported some really extreme and unusual pardons that have been granted during the early months of the Trump administration. One of them was the pardon of a Virginia sheriff named Scott Jenkins. Jenkins was a Trump booster who was actually selling badges for cash. He was selling sheriff's badges to people who were then using them to buy guns that they couldn't have otherwise legally possessed or to get out of traffic tickets. And he was enriching himself by selling the official instruments of his office to the highest bidder. And this is the type of pardon that Ed Martin has said he believes is a good use of the president's pardon power. So it's very alarming to see that he's the person who is occupying my old job. It's also notable that he has another job in the Department of Justice. He's the director of the Weaponization Work Group, which is the group that has formed to go after the president's political rivals through prosecutions. So he is spearheading the investigation of Letitia James in New York City. He's spearheading the investigation of Adam Schiff, the senator from California. He is spearheading the investigation of Lisa Cook, the Federal Reserve board member. All of these mortgage fraud cases he's deeply involved in. So he's kind of been entrusted with this rewards and punishment system of justice that the Trump administration has embraced. He's, on the one hand, prosecuting the president's political rivals, and on the other hand, doling out pardons as favors to MAGA loyalists.
And what do you? I'm a little flabbergasted, but what do you think the implications are for justice when you consider the power that somebody like Ed Martin is now wielding and the way in which he's wielding it?
It's terrifying. It's really terrifying to see how
Yeah.
much power he doesn't have any background in federal criminal law. He doesn't have the relevant experience. He's just been placed in this position because he is a willing political operative for the president. That's
Wow.
dangerous. It's frightening, and it's really destructive of the fundamental principles that our justice system is based on.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so rife with abuse. Well, let me ask you a different question, though. So he installs Ed Martin in your former position, but then he also, President Trump, that is what I'm saying, he also brings on Alice Johnson to serve in some capacity. And can you tell us who she is and what your impression is of that appointment?
Yeah, so Alice Johnson is a formerly incarcerated person who received a pardon from Donald Trump during his first administration. And she's been put into this new role of pardon czar. My understanding is that she works out of the White House, not the Justice Department. And I don't fully understand what her responsibilities and duties are. But what I do know is that there's a huge backlog of cases that are going to the Justice Department right now, people who are applying and not getting any consideration because they're going through the ordinary clemency process, which seems to have now become totally inoperative and defunct. The Office of the Pardon Attorney, where I used to work for many, many years, tracked on its website the number of pending clemency applications that were open at any time. And as of July, the number was up to over 11,000. So there were over
Mm,
11,000 people who were waiting for decisions on their clemency applications. And all of those people are now being overlooked in favor of those who have direct connections with the White House. The department around July stopped publishing that number for the first time that I know of, and they seem to have realized that this is not a good look, so they're just going to stop sharing the number of clemency applications that are open. But I think what we've learned now about clemency is that in this administration you have to have an inside connection to be considered for clemency. If you are someone who's in prison and you don't have the money to hire a lobbyist or a lawyer who can get your application directly to Donald Trump, then you're not going to be considered for that type of relief. And that is really, really unfortunate and really, really deeply unfair.
right, because aside from people with political connections, I mean, most of the people who are convicted of crimes don't have political connections. They are often poor. They are often people of color. They are often people who come from backgrounds that would not ever allow them to have the kind of connections you'd need to get in front of the president or even at the state level, the governor. Um, and so how does your understanding of what clemency should be about square with the lack of access that most people are now experiencing under the Trump administration?
Well, when I was pardon attorney, I learned that about 90% of people applying for clemency did not have attorneys representing them. We significantly overhauled the application process to try to make it more accessible and user friendly for people who are representing themselves. And in the end, those people were just as successful in the pardon process as those who had lawyers. There really wasn't any clear advantage to having a lawyer. But that has all changed. There are now lawyers who are charging seven-figure fees to apply for pardons or to assist clients in applying for pardons or lobbying for pardons. And many of them are then getting double that fee if the application is successful, which has sort of created a whole pardon economy. There's really a feeding frenzy around pardons, and it has edged out the people who are most deserving. Pardons are now being granted on the basis of political connections and political loyalty and wealth, and not on the basis of merit. People who are serving sentence that are outdated under outdated mandatory minimum laws, who've really demonstrated rehabilitation and change while they've been incarcerated, are being passed over in favor of people who just have the money to essentially pay for access to a pardon. Many of the individuals who've gotten pardons in the early months of the Trump administration have not even begun to serve their sentences. They haven't paid back any of the restitution they owe to their victims. And some of these folks owe hundreds of millions of dollars in restitution to victims. So they're not the types of people or the types of crimes that would be considered for clemency in ordinary times, but the whole system has been turned upside down by Donald Trump.
Mm, mm. No, let's just turn to you for a minute. You made sort of a heartfelt statement I saw on your amazing Substack, which we can link to at the end of in the show notes for this. So if anybody wants to continue following along with Liz's journey as she stands up for what, her vision of justice should be, I'm just wondering if you could share with us how this entire experience has sort of shaped or influenced your own personal and professional life. How has it changed how you see your role today in pursuing justice?
Yeah, my legal career really has been dedicated towards serving my fellow citizens, using my knowledge and my voice and my skills in service of my fellow citizens who are being treated harshly by the justice system. And I'm not sure how to continue to do that in the current moment. This is the first time in history where we've had an administration, where we've had leadership of the Justice Department that seems to be embracing the idea that it is okay to give special treatment to people who have wealth and power. It is okay that we have a justice system where people are not treated equally. We've never in history had a justice system that was perfect. The inequities in our justice system were always apparent to me as a public defender, but we all seem to agree that we should be striving toward a justice system where people receive equal treatment regardless of their wealth or their race or their status. But that seems to have fallen away, that basic fundamental disagreement about what our justice system should look like. A lot of things are being reshaped dramatically inside the Justice Department right now. And I'm still trying to figure out how I fit into all of that. One of the places where I've realized I can add value is by educating the public, particularly non-lawyers, about some of the concerning things that are happening right now and about the legal issues that affect all of us. So I've been using my platform, my Substack, as well as Instagram and TikTok to make videos talking about current legal issues and to try to share my knowledge with folks who are engaged and interested. I don't know where I will be in a couple of years from now, and I don't know what our justice system will look like, but I'm hoping that I can find a way to continue to serve my fellow citizens.
Yeah. Well, I hope you can too, because you are an amazing advocate with a beautiful vision of justice. Um, and before we wrap up, I'm just wondering, so what about the young lawyers or the young folks who are thinking about becoming lawyers? What might you recommend to them um, as they think about this potential career, given the current climate? And what would you tell people who think the system, particularly the system for second chances, is just broken right now?
Well, I think that being a lawyer is as valuable now as ever, maybe even more valuable. We need people who are willing to stand up for what's right, to use their voices on behalf of fellow citizens who are being mistreated by our legal system. And there are so many of them right now. I think being a lawyer is a really noble profession, and it's a really incredible way to serve your fellow citizens. But it's also a really challenging time to get into the law. Lots of things are changing, and we're seeing institutions, including law firms and universities, really compromise their values in service of the agenda of this political administration. So I think the most important thing for lawyers to know in this time and people getting into the legal profession is that your integrity is really vital to your ability to do the work. And once you compromise your integrity, you cannot get it back. I think you have to go into the legal profession determined to protect your own integrity, even if it comes at a short-term cost or a personal cost to you. In my situation, it never really was a question that I wasn't going to be able to make this recommendation to give Mel Gibson his gun rights back. I knew it was very consequential what I was doing and that it might have real costs for my career. And in the end, I lost my job, and it was worth it because I walked away from that with my integrity intact.
Well, thank you so much, Liz, for coming on Just Justice and sharing your experience and your thoughts about clemency under this current administration. We really appreciate all that you are doing to keep our democracy alive and thriving.
Thank you so much for having me, Jessica. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Just Justice. If you like what you heard, please follow us wherever you listen to podcasts and tell a friend. To share an idea for the show or to stay in touch, head to jessicahenryjustice.com or find me on the socials at Jessica Henry Justice. See you next time.